Hello, everyone. It's so nice that you could join us all here tonight to celebrate the publication of Ceremony of Innocence. This is Madeleine's terrific novel, which is published just this month. I am Bella Lacey. I'm Madeleine's editor at Granta. So Ceremony of Innocence is a work of sort of compelling political intrigue and excavation. It's also a compulsive, thrilling read. It's set in Bahrain, Iran, and the English countryside, and it explores one English family's ambition in the aftermath of empire and delves into the legacy of Britain's involvement in the Middle East. I find it a really particularly relevant and engrossing novel at this time, with our increased focus on Britain's colonial past and on the secret webs of power born out of that period that are running through the establishment today. The Observer likened Ceremony of Innocence to a John le Carré novel and called it wonderfully original and compelling. And it's very apposite that earlier this week, Prospect named Madeleine one of the world's top 50 thinkers. This is just a fantastic accolade and evidenced in Ceremony of Innocence in the years of research and inquiry which underpin it. So, I mean, really congratulations, Madeleine, on that. Also, just congratulations on this brilliant book. It's a wonderful read. If anyone wants to buy it, you can find it for a special discounted price on Granta's website if you've got the offer code on the invitation to hand. We'd really hoped to celebrate tonight in person, but because of the COVID restrictions, we've arranged instead for what's going to be a fascinating conversation about the book, chaired by Claire Armitstead. Claire is the Associate Editor for Culture at The Guardian. She's also The Guardian's former literary editor and a trustee of Penn. And in a conversation just earlier this week, she described herself as a child of empire as well. So it'll be very interesting to hear her perspective on the issues raised tonight. And Madeleine's going to be joined in conversation by two outstanding academics and social activists, Alpa Shah, the Orwell Prize-winning author of Night March and a social anthropologist at the LSE, and Ala'a Shebabi, who's Deputy Director of the UCL Institute for Global Prosperity. So I'm really delighted they could join us this evening. During the conversation, if you've got any comments to make, you want to join in, please will you add your comments in the chat box. And we're recording this session, so it'll be very nice. We'll have a record of any comments that you make. If you've got a question, please will you just flag it up with maybe question in the chat box. And then when Claire comes to the Q&A in the last 10-15 minutes, she can pick out your questions and you can ask them in conversation at the end. There's one last bit of housekeeping. If you could keep your video muted during the conversation, that'd be great. That would really help with the sound. So now I'm going to pass over to Claire Armitstead.
Thanks very much, Bella. In fact, I describe myself as a child of the evil empire, since my father worked for a tobacco company. So we were doubly implicated. But we were in Nigeria, and it actually made me think a bit about the title of the book. And I wanted to start, Madeleine, by asking you about this title, because a lot of people probably won't know where it comes from, but it does seem very, very relevant. Tell us about why it's called Ceremony of Innocence.
I think there's a sort of, obviously it comes from the wonderful poem by Yeats, The Second Turning.
The Second Coming.
Sorry?
The Second Coming.
Sorry, The Second Coming.
Yeah.
And thanks for the correction. Claire's fantastic in our poetry group. She always makes us sure that we're online. But I'm interested in innocence. I think one of the kind of big questions that runs through the novel is who is innocent? Who can claim innocence? And can anyone claim innocence? So I'm intrigued by that sort of question. And to be honest, I'm not sure I come to very clear conclusions. Obviously, that's part of the way I'm sort of trying to open up a subject. I think there is the character of Reem, the Bahraini young woman, I would argue is quite definitely innocent. What I think is also fascinates me is the word ceremony, because of course, in some ways, ceremony is a wonderful thing, it's dignified, but in another way, we use it as a very pejorative word, that something is not authentic. And I think the Wilcox-Smith family, who are threaded throughout this book at several different time periods, perform in a certain way. They perform their social lives, their domestic lives, and they perform it with a great deal of dignity and aesthetic appeal. They have this large country house, and they have exquisite taste. And so I'm sort of fascinated by how they would believe themselves in many ways, I think, to be innocent. And they perform this ceremony of innocence. So it's both the ersatz versions of innocence and what one could argue is a genuine claim to innocence of a character like Reem. And then between those two are all sorts of other different forms of innocence. Innocence comes from the word not knowing, and Kate, one of the key characters, doesn't know a lot of things about the history of Britain and the British Empire. So I'm interested in all those different dimensions to innocence. Sorry, that's a long answer, Claire.
No, it's. I mean, that's actually exactly what I wanted to hear. But there's another thing about it, isn't there? That this is the Second Coming is a poem that has been used and used and used. And I grew up in Nigeria, where Chinua Achebe, a doctor, used it for Things Fall Apart, which was written in 1958, in the year of my birth, funnily enough. So it's a novel that a poem has been used to summon up the modern world coming to terms with the end of empire ever since it was written, because actually it was written in 1919 and it was coming to terms with the Irish problem and the end of the Second World War and the cracking open of the world. So it is a sort of inspired choice.
Well,
tell us about
definitely nodding to precisely that history, and you know, very kind of consciously kind of trying to sort of reference a sort of tradition of a kind of critique of empire, which I'm very, very admiring of. So absolutely.
Tell us about the time scale and why you've picked this particular one.
Well, in a way, my attention got caught by sort of two different historical incidents. And one was the Shah's party in Persepolis in 1971, when the Shah threw the world's biggest party and invited every head of state to just outside Shiraz, the great historic ruins of Persepolis, where he decided to stage this gigantic pageant of Iranian culture. And he was celebrating the anniversary of the great ruler of Cyrus. And he was trying to present Iran to the world as this meeting point between East and West, between both sort of pre-Islamic culture and Islamic culture, as a kind of mediator in a kind of global cultural politics. And he flew in, he had caterers flying in from Maxime's in Paris, champagne by the bucket load, trees imported from Spain, birds that were to sit in the trees. It was the most extraordinarily lavish experiment with cultural diplomacy. And I think I was really sort of mesmerized by the accounts that Adam Curtis, he was the filmmaker that brought this to my attention in his work. That it was a moment of astonishing hubris when the West was pouring investment and looking for lucrative contracts in the corruption of the Shah's Iran. And there were just so many dimensions to that fascinated me, about our understanding of modernity, our understanding of the kind of inevitability of modernity. You know, people thought they were modernizing Iran. The Shah did, the Shah's wife, and the Westerners were very eagerly assisting with every aspect of modernization. And we all know what happened in 1978. That was roundly rejected in a sort of shock to the West, that I think now we sort of slightly forget the astonishing kind of the idea that Iran could reject that Western model of modernization was a sort of profound shock to the West. So that was one historical moment. And the other historical moment that I was completely transfixed by was when I was a columnist in 2011, writing about a whole range of subjects, but the Arab Spring was one of them, and the way in which there was a huge surge of hopefulness within The Guardian amongst correspondents who'd worked extensively across the Arab world at the idea that there could be finally change on the way. And out of all of the different stories of the Arab Spring in Libya and the demonstrations across the Arab world in Egypt, Bahrain seemed to me so desperately poignant, and it sort of transfixed me. The idea of a huge proportion of the population were demonstrating at the Pearl Roundabout in 2011. The country is majority Shia, and it's had the corrupt rule of the Sunni royal family for centuries. And this was a bold moment when they hoped they could finally bring about change. And the crushing of that was so brutal, and the way that the soldiers burst into the hospitals and arrested doctors and nurses and medical professionals who were treating the protesters. And I wrote a column about this, and this was a really key trigger. I wrote a column about this, about the way in which the British had played a role in the propping up of this corrupt regime in Bahrain. And I drew parallels with other parts of the empire. And I got an intriguing email from somebody who said, you don't know the half of it, that the connections between how the British suppressed Mau Mau and the ways in which the Bahraini regime is able to suppress protest in Bahrain are intimately linked through the career of a particular individual, Ian Henderson. And that took me back to my Cambridge studies, and I'm delighted to see here that John Lonsdale, Professor John Lonsdale, who's a fellow of Trinity, who was my wonderful teacher in my history degree at Cambridge. I'm delighted to see that he's logged on, which is a great delight to me. But he taught me the history of Mau Mau and how the British repressed Mau Mau. So it's a great pleasure to have him with us.
There's a lot of research has obviously gone into what it was like to be there. It's very fragrant novel, if I can use that word. How have you been there yourself? Are you very familiar with it, that world?
Well, I went to Iran in 2007 on a press trip with the British Museum, which was one of those astonishing 5 days in which I don't think I've ever been quite so culturally poleaxed. The combination of Neil MacGregor and Iran was overwhelming. And the visit, for example, we visited the British Embassy in the center of Tehran, and that features in the novel, and that is just the most astonishing place. This oasis of green velvety lawns right in the center of probably what is one of the most crowded cities in the world, which is an absolute sort of cacophony of noise and color and smells. And then suddenly you stumble into a little bit of Surrey. It's just insane. So I had a little taste of Iran. I had hoped to go back, but was advised on security grounds that was, as a former journalist, just too dangerous. And then I read other people's accounts, and I didn't get to Bahrain. I had hoped to do so, but there was, COVID intervened just at the key moment when I could have perhaps tried to get out. So this is some of the fragrance, as you put it, Claire, is based on some wonderful, wonderful reading of Iranian authors and Bahraini writers.
It's interesting that you went with the British Museum, because one of the themes going through it is collecting and the sort of Orientalism, and all these ancient sort of stately homes in England full of Oriental treasures, some of which were illegally, well, a lot of which were illegally obtained, as indeed were a lot of the treasures in Neil MacGregor's ex-custodianship. But we'll move on from that now it seems like a good moment to bring Alpa in. Alpa, welcome. Can you give us a bit of context? What was Britain doing there? What was it doing in the Gulf?
I just want to pick you up, Claire. It wasn't collecting. What I get from Madeleine is it was stealing,
Stealing. I take the correction. Yes, I absolutely take the correction.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to hand over to Ala'a, I guess, in a bit, to tell us much more about Bahrain and what Britain was doing there. She's the expert. I'm really interested in the critique of empire that lies at the heart of Madeleine's book, and why we have it as fiction. And I was reminded of Thomas More when he wrote his Utopia, that this really powerful tract. He was saying that he was compelled to write it as fiction, whereby the truth, as if smeared by honey, might fit a little might a little more pleasantly like slip into men's minds, you know. And I see Madeleine's book very much in this part of this long trajectory of political fiction, which is charted by Moore and many others, Orwell most famously, books that perhaps, you know, like as fiction might more powerfully slip into minds than maybe if it was laid bare as a journalistic exposition. I'm really interested in Madeleine's trajectory as a journalist, and, you know, why we have, you know, the relationship between fiction and non-fiction in her writing. And so then I'm led to ask, you know, what's going on here, and books that are what more powerfully slip into whose minds, you know, whose minds is this a book about? And for me, this is really a book. I mean, what's going on here, the bigger picture seems to be actually, Madeleine, you will correct me, but it seems to be actually really a critique of the British establishment, a critique of souls that are, you know, completely lost after the end of colonialism, scrambling like for some kind of imperial replacement for the money, the power, and the status. You know, Claire, you said you're a child of, you know, the evil empire, but I'm like, when you read this, you're thinking, well, you know, could empire been anything other than evil? I mean, yes, there is a ceremony of innocence, and that's so beautiful about, you know, Madeleine's book. It is a ceremony, it's a ritual that hides so much. You know, so it's the power of the book is showing the long lasting shadow of empire and its ties to capitalism, a word that, you know, Madeleine, I don't think you ever use, but it's really about this. It's about how this relationship morphs from settler colonialism to something that is perhaps even darker, you know, under the guise of defense and security, the arms industry now growing only more important, but also development. And, you know, you're focusing on the Middle East, Madeleine, where these issues are perhaps in some ways the sharpest, but some of this story really is, you know, you said it could be told about many other parts of the world, not least South Asia, where I do most of my research. And you know, your characters like Hussein, the Bahraini doctor, and is to me very much, you know, we were talking the other day, like very much like Dr. Aziz in E.M. Forster's Passage to India. You know, there's this tragic story from the time he's picked up in Arab Spring, and that continues not only in his life, but through the life of his daughter, Reem. But in some ways, to me, the most interesting characters are actually those from, you know, the Wilcox Smiths, who represent, you know, this kind of entitlement, the snobbery, the racial prejudices in so many subtle ways, and of course the dirty secrets of how, you know, empire sustains itself.
It brings to mind to me Hannah Arendt's great thing about the banality of evil, because in a way, and Martin Wilcox Smith is a very banal figure, isn't he? But he, you know, he's the sort of somebody who didn't know quite what to do with himself when he couldn't get anywhere in the diplomatic service and it was all wrapping up, but that's all he knew how to do. I mean, you know, living in Nigeria, for the whole of my conscious life, it was an independent country, but there were loads of these figures, these people hanging around who just wanted to be able to sort of feather their nests back home, or in his case, keep his, you know, finance his stately pile, keep it going for the next generation. But the evil that very banal impulse unleashes has echoed through the century and has landed us where we are now, really, hasn't it?
Yeah, and it's represented by these different, you know, like I was thinking about Orwell with his clubhouse. You know, he's got this clubhouse in the Burmese, in the, you know, the book about Burma that he wrote when he was a police officer, and in a way you've got the banality of evil represented through the stately home, you know, these stately homes which are marking our landscape, and I was really thinking a lot of, you know, this banality of evil and how we're unveiling it. You know, now we've had the Black Lives Matter movement, so really focusing on these stately homes, and at the moment, you know, National Trust basically revealing, you know, having to say that, yes, we've got, you know, colonialism in these buildings and slavery in these buildings, but what Madeleine's book really shows us is that how this message needs to go even sharper, right? It needs to be actually be a broader message, that it's not just about the past, it's about what's happening now. And you know, the chameleon-like nature of this relationship, which morphs into, you've got colonialism, but now you've got, you know, property development, and then you've got you know, circumcision. It was this female you know, development programs against female circumcision. You know, you have this Dottie, the character, the daughter of Martin Wilkins-Smith. She's taking up all of these campaigns, and it all looks so beautiful. You know, it's not only the banality of evil, actually it's got this veneer which is so beautiful. And then, but behind that, what is being hidden behind that is this very dark face of imperialism, which is, you know, everywhere around us. It's in the English countryside, everywhere. You can't escape it, and we're all complicit. And I love that feeling that, you know, you evoke through Kate, that, you know, she's a part of it too, you know, even though she's in love with this Bahraini doctor, and it's we turn our eye, you know, we're blind, we're blind, you know, we're blind to it, you know, we can't, and Madeleine really lays this bare, and I really wanted to ask you, Madeleine, about fiction. Like, why fiction? Why, what, you know, why fiction? I mean, you're a journalist, a writer whose non-fiction has been so powerful. And I'm just thinking about The Labours of Love. It's such a, you know, wonderful, beautiful, powerful book. So why fiction for these issues? Is it really the case that for this book and its audience, as Thomas More said, that the truth, as if smeared by honey, might just more pleasantly slip into people's minds? Or might it actually make it easier to ignore? Just another story, only a little story, you know? Or would the same revelations in non-fiction not have been more powerful, for then they simply can't be denied? And, you know, we could actually lead to inquiries and use this information. And anyway, I'm just really interested to hear Madeleine speak a little bit about the relationship between fiction and non-fiction, and her writing, and why for this book fiction, and did she contemplate non-fiction, and did you, Madeleine? Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe Claire, we should hear from Ala'a before I kind
let's park that question and come back to that. Yeah, I think that is pretty central. So Ala'a, if we can just bring you in now, because you have a more specific knowledge of that particular region, particularly Bahrain. Will you talk to us about how representative was this portrait, albeit fiction?
I was going to say, I can answer that Alpa's question for Madeleine, if she doesn't mind, in the sense that, you know, there's so many dense, heavy books that are non-fiction about, not so many, I would say about 3 or 4, that are quite, you know, well researched from the archives, but we don't have a fictional book. And from here, I kind of laud Madeleine for taking inspiration from the few stories that she heard back in 2011. I remember her article specifically back then. And so whilst it was so shocking to see doctors, you know, 50 doctors arrested in one day simply for being in a hospital as soon as the Saudis invaded the country, for her to kind of pick that encounter and fictionalize it, I think was really, really powerful. Albeit it's just a part of Hussein's story, and the story of how, I wouldn't say a new type, but the kind of a model of an immigrant that's, you know, middle class, educated, that finds themselves in exile, but then get put into this category of a refugee, and dehumanized in the way, with all the tropes that we think refugees are about, after the Arab Spring. So it was kind of, you know, she humanized Hussein in that sense and made him sort of respectable enough to be considered in this kind of story about the British, and you know, it's the kind of immigrant that may be allowed into the spaces of the white middle and upper classes. As we can see, you know, the whole setting was in that kind of that bubble of a privileged elite, and the juxtaposition of Hussein's experience, coming from Bahrain, but also what he was doing when he was mysteriously disappearing at night. I'll take you just a bit back about the situation that was in Bahrain at the time, starting in 2011. And here, you know, I assumed that the audience wouldn't know anything about Bahrain, but I mean, looking at the lists, I think, you know, our audience does know, you know, where Bahrain is. It's a small island, about half the size of the UK. It's an archipelago of 33 countries. And it was a British protectorate. It signed a treaty with the British in 1820. And it was a protectorate in name because it was the idea with the British, it wasn't a full colony, didn't have full colony status, but it was protected from external aggression. And but in the course of that, increasingly, the British agents were taking more and more control of administration and bureaucracy in the country. And then here we see within the book some, some hints to the most notorious of those agents. Prior to the withdrawal of the British in 1971, after Harold Wilson decided in '68 to withdraw from east of Suez. Prior to that, it was the most famous of the agents was Charles Belgrave, and you cite Adam Curtis's blog on Belgrave, and they're fascinating. I mean, if you want this story to come alive historically, there are a few clips of Charles Belgrave's. You know, they're anti-British, anti-British, anti-king and anti-me, you know, like about the protests that were happening at the time, while he's viciously smoking a cigarette, incredibly distressed that there were, the savages were rising. And then after 1971, we had Ian Henderson that Madeleine mentioned, the Butcher of Bahrain, and there's a character that's sort of mentioned in passing about Ian Henderson. But then until today, we see this very strong relationship between the UK and Britain. And me as a British Bahraini, it's always been, I was born and raised as a daughter of an exilee. We have kind of these uprisings every 10 years. So there's waves and waves of not waves. I mean, we're only about 100 of us in the UK or something. But you're conflicted in the sense that the country you've sought asylum in is also one of the biggest allies of the country you've escaped from. And there's this dichotomy of being both the hub of the opposition here in the UK, and there I note this is how well researched the book was, as our community centre in King's Cross was mentioned, and very small details like that I picked up on personally. So the idea is that the UK until today has a very strong relationship. Boris Johnson in his speech when he was in Manama in the Manama Dialogues, I think it was 2016 or 2017. Your security is our security. He says something like this. Any crisis in the Gulf is a crisis for Britain from day one. Your security is our security, and we recognize the wisdom of those who campaigned for a policy of engagement east of Suez. Almost, that kind of imperial nostalgia is evoked, especially when the people in the current government talk about the Gulf, and they use it as a reason to continue the kind of trade and business and trade relationships between the Gulf. I mean, the 2 years following the 2011, I was part of a collective and we were doing a lot of monitoring. The Bahrainis spent about 53 million on PR companies alone. So again, if we go back to the Wilcoxes and the businesses that they were in, I mean, it seemed like they were doing everything, but other than arms, which is the obvious one, they were doing PR. And a lot of my colleagues and stuff, people like Mark Owen Jones, we began seeing like issues of fake news before they became a thing after the British election, issues of disinformation, the use of bots, and were being used very early on. And the spending on PR companies and Facebook advertising, was happening from these regimes. Obviously, it's become more prominent now with the Saudis. But it was there were inclinations that those tactics were being pushed by British PR companies, people like companies like Bell Pottinger who are now thankfully out of business. So I don't know, maybe Bell Pottinger is the inspiration for this, but we need a part 2 of the book, basically, Madeleine.
Okay, we do. I have 2 very basic questions. One is, what is the relationship between Bahrain and Iran like now? And the second is, why is Bahrain so important? Why does it have such a history?
Yeah,
with
I don't know. I'm flabbergasted. The King of Bahrain was the only foreign dignitary that I haven't checked who else was at the Queen's 90th birthday party, but he was there next to the Queen, sitting side by side, and he's there every year in the horse show, more so than other Gulf sheikhs. I don't know if it's a mutual feeling or if the King of Bahrain particularly insists, but there is a very personalized relationship between the ruling families. and or the royal family and the ruling family, or the royal families. And yeah, they're they're, you know, modeled as kind of, they model themselves around the British, you know, in the way they, you know, they're obsessed with horse riding and English country estates and castles and so on, and their investments here. Yeah. And so there's a very special person, like more so, and regarding the relationship between Bahrain and Iran, you know, I always said that Bahrain is kind of geographically misplaced because it's neighbored by Saudi Arabia and Iran, and as a very small island state, it's always had to have a protection of one or the other kind of power in the region. And obviously we see now Bahrain is effectively a vassal state of Saudi Arabia, and part of that means its foreign policy is also firmly sort of controlled and dictated by Saudi Arabia. In that sense, there's this kind of Cold War now between Iran and the Gulf. And unfortunately, when, you know, I mean, we're a very small island, that we're not like, you know, like Syria, we don't have permeable borders or anything like that. So very kind of, there's always uprisings, but the usual straw man that's used, and others, is that Iran, there's a, you know, potentially an Iranian takeover via these protesters. And because where the majority was Shia historically, there's always a suspicion, because the relationship between Bahrainis and the royal family differs from the other Gulf states, because the Al Khalifas were outsiders who invaded, whereas in the other Gulf states there was a tribal sort of balance in the way the nation state was formed in the post-colony. So in that sense, there was never a social contract. It goes back, you know, hundreds of years, that was reconciled in Bahrain between the ruling family and the majority that were of a different background. And so immediately there's this minority rule paranoia that these protesters must be Iranian agents and so on. And so yeah, I guess it's important to have fiction where characters like Hussein can speak and express, you know, simply what was happening. It wasn't that complicated actually, but it's a very strategic place. There's a Fifth Fleet there. There's an American naval base, and it's been, yeah, it's in that part of the Gulf where they kind of there's an important trade route basically for oil and other goods.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the royal family. Madeleine, I want to come back to you as a way into, with a tabloid journalist's head on my shoulders, that lots of royals flit through this novel, don't they? I mean, they're really implicated, the royal family. They're all there at Persepolis. They're sort of, you know, Prince Andrew's there, Princess Anne's there. I mean, is this part of the reason why you wanted to write it as fiction? Because it's got such a wonderfully rich range of characters.
Well, that's sort of like two questions wrapped up into one, which is one about this bizarre relationship with between the royal family and Bahrain, and another about, you know, there's another question there about why I chose to write fiction. Just to deal with the royal family issue, I think it's fascinating, and who knows when we'll ever get to the bottom of that question that Ala'a raises. Is it the Bahraini ruler who insists on coming to the 90th birthday party, or is it the royal family who is instructed by Downing Street to invite him? You know, we just don't know where the real driver for that relationship is, but it is really strikingly close. I mean, 2011, there was obviously protests against the abuse of human rights when the protests were suppressed. But within a couple of years, the ruler of Bahrain is giving the Queen a horse, and the Queen is giving the ruler of Bahrain a horse. So, you know, relations are pretty swiftly put back into place. And then Charles, I think, opened the base for the Fifth Fleet. Am I right, Ala'a? So, you know, dignitaries go back and forth on a fairly regular basis. And the ruler of Bahrain was in London, I think, only a couple of months ago, photographed on the doorstep of Downing Street. All of this kind of official recognition in the UK builds the profile and credibility of the ruler of Bahrain. You know, it's about status. And I think, I'm pretty sure, you know, they get invited to a lot of royal weddings and so forth. To go back to why did I write fiction? Well, it's not that fiction is better than journalism or better than non-fiction. It's just trying another sort of tool in the box, if you like. You know, if you're committed to language and writing as a way of broadly, in its broadest sense, a form of activism, and I would stress the broadest sense, then I think there's always some element of that activism in all my writing. And it may be very overt when I was a columnist, because I was sort of telling everybody, this must not happen. And, you know, columnists sort of wag their fingers and so forth. But I think in, you know, in the years since I gave up being a journalist, I'm interested in different approaches, which are perhaps less hectoring and more about laying seeds, kind of getting people to just start, you know, just scatter the seed and see where it lands, and maybe it will help to sort of get people thinking about something in a new way or a different way. So you know, and then I think then another reason why I turn to fiction is there's always got to be a playfulness in writing fiction. I mean, there is a kind of pleasure in trying to link these two historical moments that transfixed me. It's almost like a jigsaw puzzle. How can I connect these two bits? Because they do actually have all sorts of connections, which are not necessarily very obvious. But the whole of my plot really is structured about finding a way to put these two historical events into a novel. And, you know, I start with those and then build up the characters from there. Whereas perhaps sometimes other novelists might start with a particular character. So you know, it's fun. I mean, I know novel writing is also really, really hard work and extremely painful at times, but there is a playfulness to it. And I guess that's part of why I turn to fiction, because, you know, writing columns is not playful. You know, you have a very the requirements of a column are quite constraining. You know, you've got to have clear conclusions, you've got to have answers, God damn it. You know, you've got to tell everybody exactly what they ought to be thinking. And I, to be honest, I slightly lost. I mean, Neil McGregor, to go back to Neil, said basically that columnists have inherited the role of Protestant preacher. So columnists are now the people who climb up into the pulpit and tell everybody else what to think. And I lost interest in that form of communication. And so fiction struck me as another way to draw people into dialogue, if you like.
I was interested that the Guardian reviewer described it as a wonderfully original and compelling novel, but it is also in a tradition of colonial novels. I mean, you know, you could think of The Remains of the Day, Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day, the Olivia Manning novels, you know, the Paul Scott, the Staying On novels. There is and I was sort of interested in the extent to which those novels have been forgotten about. That tradition of post-colonial writing, realist post-colonial writing, has actually been forgotten. So it seems like this is something completely fresh and new, which is not a criticism of it, because I think that, you know, the part of the power of fiction is how a novel fits into the canon. Yeah,
well, I mean, you know, I did a Guardian column this week about the top 10 books on the end of empire. And I would love to see it sort of fitting in. I mean, you know, all the books you're mentioning, I read voraciously, loved, reread when I was researching this book. I mean, Passage to India, I spent 2 very soggy days in a Scottish caravan devouring A Passage to India, and realizing, this was after I'd done the first draft of the novel, I realized how deeply informed it was by Forster, who was one of my great, you know, loves as a teenager. I absolutely gobbled up his writing. And, you know, as Alpa has said, you know, I've landed with another Muslim doctor, and I'd forgotten that. So I think that canon has really kind of affected me deeply. Another contemporary novel, which I'm just sort of awestruck by, is Zia Hadar Rahman, In the Light of What We Know. And, you know, there's no way I can ever begin to approach the sophistication of his work, because it's absolutely spectacular. But it's great to see the top of the mountain that you're trying to climb, even if you're not going to get yourself to the top. And I think that Rahman is reflecting on the confusion and the complexity of the end of empire in some quite similar, you know, there's definitely resonances between us. I mean, the thing about Rahman is that he's an extremely brilliant young British student at Oxford, Asian extraction background from London, very poor background, who falls deeply in love with a very, very beautiful young British aristocrat. So he has put into that relationship this as Alpa says, the thing about this kind of, you know, evil is it's not banal in the Arendt phase. It's a phrase. It's kind of seductive. It's you know, exquisitely beautiful, often impeccable manners, and deeply charming. And so Rahman sort of you know, goes through torture with this aristocrat. And I found that book was hugely inspiring for me in all kinds of ways.
One of the character who's almost most evil is Dottie, who's the daughter of the house, who takes on the mantle and the responsibility, one way of looking at it, and takes on the sort of legacy of meddling. Is the other way of looking at it. And you raised the idea that the sort of sinister relationship between oil and security, and so arms and oil, that exchange has now morphed into an exchange between security and aid. And I wondered what Alpa and Ala'a thought of that. I thought that was a very interesting area of it. Alpa.
As I said, that's certainly something that I totally, you know, loved and picked up on. And, you know, it's this chameleon-like nature of this changing relationship with empire. You know, you have the Martin Wilcox Smith's generation, and that's like now gone. And this really hard-nosed Dottie, who is like, as you say, she is the one that appears the most evil of the lot. But it, you know, and there's so much, I mean, there's so much academic work on this, of course, you know, the ways in which development agendas are just a kind of beautiful face, you know, the aid agenda, like education programs. Who is funding these education programs? What, you know, what are the multinational corporations like in India that are funding so many of these health clinics, education programs, and, you know, what lies behind it? Where are they getting their money from to then, you know, clean it through these development programs? And there is, of course, a very, very very dark history, which is captured so well in this transformation, that intergenerational transformation from Martin Wilcox Smith to his daughter Dottie. Totally picked up on that. Yeah.
Ala'a, do you have anything to say on that area?
Yeah, I mean, lots to say. That political economy of that continues after the withdrawal of the British in new forms and new guises. So you immediately see it when they move from Tehran to the Gulf. You know, he needs some money. He's only I don't know, deputy ambassador or something, and he's got this estate, and you know, he needs to make a quick buck. And with the withdrawal, you know, there's spaces for these private security consultants to start building the new police apparatus, and so the grift is brought to life, right? Like these are the hustlers, these are the grifters, but they do it with such style and guise, and they love it. And it was, so the 70s was a particularly lucrative period. If you were there, you know, you could monopolize these spaces and build private, you know, private companies to kind of to fill the void and as advisors. But that continues until today. You know, the former police chief of the Met, John Yates, you know, as soon as he was out of the job, the first place he went to advise was Bahrain in just 2012, you know, and this is all done with a discourse and a discursive discourse of reform. So we're there to help. We're always there to help these, you know, our friends who can tend to be a bit violent, tend to be a bit savage and violent with their people, but we're there to help them through this. And so that kind of narrative is more necessary for the British. It's never done with people like me in mind. It's done to kind of continue to justify those kind of relations, those kind of means of extraction of those kind of resources. And so you know, even after Brexit, you know, the Gulf is pitched to be, you know, one of the areas they you know, the Britain can continue to trade with. So it's very lucrative. We've seen scores of bribery cases from BAE and others. I think the SFO was mentioned, the Serious Fraud Office and others, where this is very, very high level corruption. And, you know, there's a whole genre as well. I mean, I know we talk about the end of empire. That's important, I think. And there's something romantic and nostalgic about that period. But if you bring it, what's harder to write is, you know, modern versions of how that, you know, that kind of, that continues. So the kind of, I think my friend sent me a link to a new book that was published. You know, scandals like 1MDB, the BAE bribery scandals, these are all kind of embodied in our, you know, in today's contemporary world in the forms of, you know, 5-star hotels and parties and yachts and these kind of things. So what Phoebe experienced in Tehran prior to the revolution is actually the story of the Gulf since the 70s. You know, the kind of lavishness and lavish parties and insane, ludicrous amounts of extravagance. But yeah, so Martin is the grifter, is the hustler, and what Dottie comes is she inherits that. So she comes at it with an even more stronger sense of entitlement and privilege. You know, her arrogance is unsurpassed. I mean, it's not just unapologetic, and she can think even deeper. She then works at this level. The money's been made, the wealth is there, it needs to be preserved. She then dresses it up in conferences, in you know, the kind of, she's dotting around, you know, continuing the lavishness, you know, hosting and the clients and dealing with the contemporary expressions of how, you know, you go from millions to billions sort of at that level. And it gets bigger and bigger. The kind of the scale of it gets insane. So they're just on the verge of that very high scale level of corruption. And so then we then see, I don't want to give any spoilers away about what then happens, the kind of, you know, the ending of what happens. Or was it the ending or the beginning now? You know, with Reem. Yeah, you know, I'm not going to get
the ending, only we don't quite know that we are at the ending at the beginning.
Don't want to give it away.
Alice in Wonderland version.
Yeah, but with that, where you see, you know, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, for example, like how do you go from this scale? You know, you have all of these billions and millions, but you would still, you know, murder and dismember a journalist or an activist or a student. So it's that kind of the irony of being both, being all powerful, but also being all petty and targeting individuals in that way is a contradiction that I think is important to kind of draw out from the book.
Now, thank you. And I know we've got some very distinguished people in the audience who will undoubtedly have contributions to make. Please, will you make your contributions? We've got 10 more minutes. Just if you just put stuff into the chat, even if you just want to say, I want to say something, I will call on you. But while you're doing that, Madeleine, the characters who are actually abused in a manner of speaking by this English family in various different ways have a really terrible time, don't they? I mean, what you represent is a relationship that is absolutely disastrous for everyone except for the people who have the stately pile that they can keep going for another generation.
So you mean their relationship with people like Kate and Hussein?
Yeah, I mean, well, Hussein, Phoebe's lover in Iran in 1971, Reem, who begins and ends the novel. I mean, there's a, you know, this is a very, very bleak picture you're painting for all its gaiety, for all the sort of complexity, emotional complexity of it. Is this how you see it?
Well, I think that there is I think Phoebe is a really interesting character because it seems to me that, you know, she's kind of very complex. Actually, she was genuinely fond of Reem, genuinely concerned. She liked Hussein, and you know, probably would like to see herself as the sort of person that does the right thing. Dottie has a kind of ruthlessness, and there was a quote of Arendt's, Hannah Arendt, that was in my mind as I wrote the book, which was about a quote, something to the effect of that when the English middle classes or upper classes had lost the empire, they lost the public spirit, and it meant they pursued self-interest with a ruthlessness and a determination which would cause untold disaster. That was the sort of drift of her comment, and I do think that that Dottie is a ruthless character. I think Martin I would say Martin is quite complex as well. I think those that were brought up on the empire were completely disorientated by the speed with which it disintegrated. And I think it's very hard for us to quite grasp what that would have looked like if you have been brought up. And the person I always think of in this respect is my grandfather, who was born in 1899. But he did believe deeply and passionately in a form of British exceptionalism, that the British were different and that we had this long tradition of freedom and respect for human rights. And that had made our empire completely different to everybody else's empire. Now, I loved my grandfather dearly, and I suspect we'd have gone on to have some fairly vigorous arguments. We certainly, you know, when I was studying history at university, were sort of beginning to start in that direction before he died in his 90s. But he was a Scot of deep moral seriousness, and he believed the empire, by and large, had been a good thing. And he would never have denied that there were catastrophes. Amritsar was a catastrophe. The suppression of Mau Mau was deeply abhorrent in many respects. So Martin, I think is a little later than my grandfather, but imagine if you have grown up as a child of the empire, literally. So you were born abroad, you fell in love with a country that was not supposed to be your home country, but actually you deeply loved it. He was born in Iran. And I think the kind of the confusion, the moral confusion of Martin was what I was trying to depict. And in the end, it was Phoebe who gave direction to his life. You know, he didn't really know how to sort himself out. And it was falling in love with a much younger woman who wanted the good life, and she knew what she needed for that was money. So I'm quite sort of intrigued by Martin. I don't like him, but I am sort of intrigued by that life story. And then,
as I said, I absolutely knew Martins in Nigeria, in the north of Nigeria in the 1970s. In that period, they were sort of all around me. I've got a question from Paul Rogers, who I was hoping would ask a question, and we knew you were going to be in the audience, Paul. And it's what do you think of Felix? Now, Felix is Dottie's brother and the son of Martin and Phoebe, and he's a slightly different sort of character. What do you think of Felix?
Well, Felix is you know, to go back to that question right at the beginning, which Claire, which I'm really grateful you asked, which was around innocence. Well, Felix represents another form of claimed innocence. He deliberately doesn't want to know. There's a sort of irresponsibility to Felix. He just wants everything to sort of, you know, collapse, and he'll just sit on the sidelines. But of course, he's benefited immensely from the family money. He's got his flat in London, and you know, what does he do with his? Well, he's become a sort of bon savant. You know, he turns up on radio programs and talks about traffic jams and makes funny jokes about things, and he's a sort of witty, a witty kind of media don, I suppose, is the kind of phrase. So he has lost the moral seriousness that his father was brought up with, and actually that is a problem. So Felix's form of innocence, I think, is deeply corrupt, because he's sort of like, I don't know anything about it. I don't care about the stately home. I don't want anything to do with the family business. And he's sort of, you know, he's kind of, you know, sort of made sure he's okay, and to hell with the rest.
He's also he's married to an Iranian, or was. I mean, that's very interesting. I was interested in that relationship.
My feeling about that was that she was Pakistani heritage.
A Pakistani. Okay, sorry. Yes. Is that explicit? Have I just not? Did I just not pick that up?
I can't remember whether it's explicit or not.
Did you pick it up, Ala'a and Alpa?
I didn't, certainly.
Yeah, I think it was in the very beginning.
Yeah.
She was British Muslim Pakistani.
But and that, I thought that was interesting, because where, you know, if you're going back to the 1970s and Phoebe's relationship, you're back to that sort of terrible thing of where the old colonials used to say, oh, she's gone native, or he's gone native. whereas so you're, go forward a generation, and that is one thing that has changed. There is in fact, you get the sense it's her who leaves him because he's useless, whereas there is some power there.
Yes, I mean, that's really interesting, that going native kind of concept, which actually I hadn't thought about before. Yes, yeah. I mean, I could have built up more in that dimension, because I think it was quite interesting what Fauzia was doing and what she was, how she understood and saw it all. But what I was hoping is that people would see that the book itself was Fauzia's perspective, because this bit at the end when she says she's going to start writing the story, then this is her viewpoint of what's going on.
Yeah. So Paul, do you want to unmute yourself? Because it would be very good to have you in this conversation. Can you do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I should be unmuted now.
Yeah. I'm interested in what it was that you particularly recognized in it.
Well, I lived in Bahrain for a number of years. I worked in Saudi Arabia, but I lived in Bahrain. And the depiction of the events of 2011 were frighteningly accurate. I mean, the Pearl Roundabout was a sort of central location. I had a close friend who owned an apartment on the Pearl Roundabout, and to see that sort of basically destroyed, and that whole area destroyed, and we had friends who were doctors, who were medics, who were arrested, and we didn't know what had happened to them for months. Some of them we never found out. It was an awful time, and it brought it so back. It brought it back with such clarity, with such realism, that it made my hairs on the back of my neck stand up, to be honest. Which is a terrific tribute to Madeleine. But I was something else I was thinking of as well, when you were talking about the sort of morality thing here and the innocence thing. Fauzia's, the theft of the hard disk. I think that's a masterstroke.
Yes.
Because there's her morality, brought really, she's on the horns of an awful dilemma. Is she going to tell Kate what happened because of everything that's happened? And yet, she's pretending to have the moral high ground, and she's a great character, Fauzi. I love the book, by the way, as you probably can tell.
Thank you, Paul. It's great you could join us. Paul's in Cyprus, so and he just emailed me yesterday, so I sent him the link and invited him. It's fantastic you could join us.
What a great way to end as well, with an absolute ringing endorsement from somebody who lived through it, Madeleine. So much for fiction being not about truth. Somehow.
Just very briefly say a few thank yous.
Yeah, of course.
So I would just, huge thanks as ever to Granta. They are the most fabulous publishers. Bella is just a terrific editor to work for. And Lamorna, Christine, Sarah, they really are at every point. It's just such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure to work with them. And a big shout out to Daphne, who I can see is knitting. But Daphne Tagg was a copy editor beyond all the Call of Duty, and I think she's just over the hill from me in Stroud, so that is delightful. And I think my agent Sarah Chalfont is here with us tonight, and I repeatedly say this, and it has to be said, Sarah is a magnificent support for me in my writing life. And then I am so grateful that Claire, Alpa and Ala'a gave up their time to have this conversation. I really appreciate it, because I know both of them are desperately busy with small children to look after as well. So I can't thank you enough. And thank you, Claire.
Well, it was a great pleasure, and I'm absolutely delighted to have read it. And I would very much, even if we've given away a few spoilers, I don't think we actually will have spoiled it, because it is a book of immense complexity and style and humanity as well. So it will not be a waste of your time to pick up that code offer on the invitation and have a read of it. Thank you very much for coming, and Madeleine, congratulations.
Thank you, Claire.